Let's go ahead and open up to Deuteronomy 16. This subject of the kingdom of God is talked about every Sabbath in some regard. It's always related to God's kingdom. And while most people were keeping the Feast of Tabernacles at various sites around the country or even around the world, there were a number of people that were unable to travel to the Feast of Tabernacles for various reasons. And some of these people might have been wondering a question. Were they violating the Scriptures, disobeying God for not traveling to the Feast of Tabernacles? And what about the other pilgrimage feasts that are held or observed throughout the year, the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost? Well, while we are out of town, we had received another question about this subject. There was a person who had contacted us through our website. They made a comment because they had read our booklet 3 times a year, which specifically talks about the offerings that are given during those pilgrimage feasts. And the question they had asked was, and I'll just quote it here, they said, "I've been studying the booklet and found it astounding. A question has come to mind. The 3 times are pilgrimages. So that being the case, why do we only pilgrimage on the Feast of Tabernacles and not the other 2 when they are commanded?" And this is a good question. It's a question that perhaps many of you may have wondered yourself. Maybe you know the answer. It's something we have discussed in the past. I don't think we've actually mentioned it specifically in a sermon. Maybe we have, but we've talked about it here, and I've talked about it personally with a number of people over the years. But I thought it might be something worth addressing in a public forum, because many have wondered this very same thing. Why does the Church of God in our age designate feast sites for the Feast of Tabernacles in various parts of the country and all around the world, but not the other pilgrimage feasts, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks? And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about that and discuss a little bit about the offerings given during those feasts as well. And so every year, the following scriptures are read. And they are read usually a minimum of 3 times during a worship service. And it's Deuteronomy 16 and verse 16 and 17, where it says, 3 times a year all your males shall appear before the Eternal your God in the place which he chooses, at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, at the Feast of Weeks, and at the Feast of Tabernacles, and they shall not appear before the Eternal empty, or empty-handed. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Eternal your God, which he has given you. So according to what we have been blessed with, what we have made, what we have saved in the festival tithe over the last year, we give accordingly. Now, the Eternal Church of God has long taught that these required offerings are to be given exactly as it says, 3 times a year. And those 3 times are stated: the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, this command has nothing to do with seasons. It does not indicate that offerings are to be given on every holy day of the year, every high day of the year, and so the offering is not required twice during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It is not required during the observance of the Memorial of Trumpets. It is definitely not to be taken up on the Day of Atonement, and it is not required to be given twice during the Feast of Tabernacles, on the first day as well as the 8th day. And so let's go over to Numbers 18 to further explore this subject. Go back here to Numbers 18. Something else that I have seen and I have heard of some groups doing is to ask brethren to give a 10th of their festival tithe to the church, and they'll call it a tithe of a tithe. Now, it's not wrong to use festival tithes to give the required offering, one of the 3 times a year. But what is wrong is to say that a tithe is a biblical principle that the brethren should follow separately from the 3 times that offerings are to be given a year. And I've heard people say that, well, the church has expenses that need to be paid for, so it's right that the people will give a tithe of a tithe to pay for the expenses incurred during the Feast of Tabernacles. So where did this concept come from? Tithe of a tithe. Is it something that's biblical that all of the brethren should be doing? Well, though the term is misused by many people today, the expression came from the fact that priests were given the first tithe. They were to receive the first tithe according to God's law, and they would use that for the work and also to live on, and this is something that God had designated. But the priests were also subject to the law of tithing themselves. So people are required to tithe. The priests are required to tithe as well. And so because they received the tithe, they would need to give a tithe of that tithe. And that is actually stated here in Numbers 18. Numbers 18 in verse 26. Well, let's read verse 25. The Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak thus to the Levites, and say to them, when you take from the children of Israel the tithes which I have given you from them as your inheritance, then you shall offer up a heave offering of it to the Eternal, a tenth of the tithe." And so, Levites were to receive the tithe, the first tithe, as do ministers receive the first tithe today according to God's law. But they are required to tithe as well, a tenth of the tithe or a tithe of a tithe. And of course, this is the correct definition of the term that some of you may have heard, even heard used during this last celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles. But the point is, this has nothing to do with people being required to give a tenth of their festival tithe to the church. And so some organizations have instituted a policy of asking their members to give a tenth, calling it a tithe of a tithe. And they say that, well, it should be given in order to pay for expenses that the church will take on during the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles, whether it be paying for a hall or flying ministers in or some other, there are many expenses that are incurred by organizations when celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles. But we don't agree with requiring people to give a tenth of their festival tithe for several reasons. And the first one is that the tithe of a tithe, according to the scriptures, came out of that which was received by the priests from the first tithe. And it didn't come from festival funds at all, funds that were saved by those people who used the funds to travel or celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread or the Feast of Weeks or the Feast of Tabernacles. And so it's misusing the term. Another reason is because God commands that an offering, as we had just read in Deuteronomy 16:16, that God commands an offering to be given 3 times a year. And he doesn't command people to give an additional offering on top of that required 3 times a year. Now, there's nothing wrong with people giving an offering if they want to do so more than 3 times a year, but we can't use the scriptures and say it's commanded for you to do it more than these 3 times a year. In addition to this, those offerings that are taken up during the celebration of these festivals, these offerings were not used primarily, they were not used for paying salaries of the priests. They were not used to purchase property or to give people bonuses. It's our view that the offerings that are given 3 times a year should not be primarily used for that. Now, if the offerings that come in 3 times a year, they are more than enough usually, well over enough to pay for all the expenses that the church has incurred during the celebration of these holy days. And there would be something left over. And of course, the leftover funds could go into a general fund of the church and used for other purposes. But those offerings are to be used for celebrating the holy days. On top of that, those offerings are actually to be used to help the brethren to celebrate the holy days. And so it has always been our policy, when we wrote this booklet many years ago, to use the festival offerings to sponsor events, something put on by the church, and not require people to give an offering and then also require them to come and pay for the events as well. But instead use the offerings to pay for those events. You pay for the hall, you pay for whatever travel expenses, whatever thing is necessary, and then there's usually quite a bit of funds left over. And that is what was done with the offerings during ancient times, is that they were used for those celebrations. And so this is, I think, thoroughly explained, I know it's thoroughly explained in our booklet that we produced nearly 20 years ago on the subject, 3 times a year. And so something I do want to point out, though, that some people don't, who have read the booklet, who agree with the 3 times a year principle, that it's not wrong for a fellowship to ask brethren for offerings when funds might be needed for one thing or another. But, of course, to call an offering a tithe of a tithe, or to say that additional offerings are required outside of the 3 times a year, that is not an accurate rendering of the Scriptures. And I know all of us here and most people listening on the phone hookup or watching on the internet are aware of our teaching on the subject, and I firmly believe this is the accurate rendering of the Scriptures and how God desired for it to be applied. And so let's get back to the question about traveling 3 times a year. Let's go over to Zechariah 14. Zechariah, just before the book of Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament Scriptures. I want to get back to this question about traveling in order to celebrate the pilgrimage feasts. And one thing I think it's worth pointing out, and this was even discussed briefly in a sermon that I had heard during the Feast of Tabernacles this last year, and that these 3 feasts, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of Weeks, Feast of Tabernacles, they are called a chag, which that's how you would pronounce it in the English. It's spelled using the English alphabet, C-H-A-G, appears to be chag. It's actually pronounced, if you consider how the Hebrews language, how they use the C and H together, it's pronounced chag. It's kind of a strange way of speaking to us, but it is actually, the language that God's people have used for many, many years. And so it's a Hebrew term, and it actually means a pilgrim feast. So the Hebrew term for pilgrimage, though, interestingly, the Hebrew term for pilgrimage is not chag, it is magur. And this term is used in the sense of lodging in a temporary abode or place. And of course, if you think of the definition, it's related to the English term sojourn, because a sojourn means that you're spending a temporary amount of time in some location, a transitory time, if you will. And of course, transitory is relative, depending on the context. I mean, technically speaking, you and I are in a transitory state right now because we're meeting in this hall. We're not going to be here for an extended period of time, and so it's a transitory place. Of course, in the context of our life in this world, we are in a transitory state, being, as the Scriptures say, pilgrims and strangers on the earth. It is a way of life, a life that we live that is sojourning, if you will. And so pilgrimage, in reference to the 3 feasts, relates to a spiritual experience. It's not just the journey itself. It's not just the worship service itself. It's a combination of things. It's a spiritual experience because of a physical act, something you are doing that actually is something that is spiritual, and it has deep spiritual meaning. And so with this in mind, this experience does not have to be connected to leaving your geographical location. It refers to a period of time that is unlike all other times of the year, regardless of where we might be on the face of the earth. So the Feast of Tabernacles, we understand very well that the Feast of Tabernacles represents the return of Jesus Christ. It represents a time when God's kingdom will be established on the earth, and the headquarters of that earthly kingdom will be where? Jerusalem, right? And so Christ is going to return. He's going to come down from the heavens. He's going to step down on Mount Olivet. The mount is going to be split in two. There's going to be a large valley that is formed, and that will be necessary in order to build the millennial temple that is described by the prophet Ezekiel in the last 8 chapters of his book. And so after that is done, God is going to require that representatives from all the families of the earth come to this place, come up to observe the Feast of Tabernacles. And they are going to be coming to a place where God has put his name. Zechariah and chapter 14, I'm going to be reading several verses, beginning in verse 16 here, that speaks of that time, where it says, "And it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Eternal of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles." So it's talking about Christ here. It's talking about God. It's talking about Jerusalem, to go up to observe one of these chags, pilgrimage feast. "And it shall be that whichever of the families of the earth do not come up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Eternal of hosts, on them there will be no rain. And if the family of Egypt will not come up and enter in, they shall have no rain. They shall receive the plague with which the Eternal strikes the nations who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And this shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations that do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles." And isn't it interesting that it talks about one of these pilgrimage feasts, but it doesn't mention the Feast of Unleavened Bread, doesn't mention the Feast of Weeks. It says they're all required to come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, one of the pilgrimage feasts. It doesn't mean that people will not come up during the other pilgrimage feasts, the chags, but it means that this one specifically, they are all going to be required, representatives from all the families of the earth. And so this is going to be the place, Jerusalem, the millennial temple there in Jerusalem, this is going to be the place where God will put his name during the millennium. And interestingly, it's also the place where he put his name in ancient times. So, because God is going to put his name in Jerusalem, because he had done it in ancient times, does that mean that nobody is allowed to observe the holy days anywhere else on the face of the earth? It's only in Jerusalem. If you don't travel and go to Jerusalem, you're violating the commandment. No, it doesn't mean that at all. It would not, in fact, if you think about it, it won't be possible for everybody to come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles or any of the holy days in Jerusalem, simply because of the amount of people. I mean, we are going to be talking about tens of hundreds of millions of people, all crowded into this. It would turn into confusion. God's not the author of confusion. So, it was also not possible for everyone to go to Jerusalem to observe, these 3 feasts every year in ancient times, simply because of the logistics. Everybody would not be able to fit into the area and be comfortably to be housed in these temporary places. I mean, could be spread out all over the mountainsides, I suppose, but it wasn't something that God actually required for everybody to do. Instead, the area simply is a place where representatives from each family would come up to keep the feast. That's going to be required in the future, and it was required of the people of God in ancient times. And so we're really getting to the heart of the matter now, a place where the answer to the question can be found about this need to travel to a location, to leave your home and go to a location 3 times a year. Because when we consider what was done more than 2,000 years ago, and when we consider what will be done in the future, we can figure out, well, what are we required to do today? What's required of us today? And so let's go into this with a little more information. If we go back, all the way back to Deuteronomy 12. Deuteronomy 12. When the command was given for certain individuals to travel during the pilgrimage feasts, God had said this. Excuse me just a moment. God had said this in Deuteronomy 12 and in verse 5. He said, "But you shall seek the place where the eternal your God chooses out of all your tribes to put his name for his dwelling place. And there you shall go. There you shall take your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the heave offerings of your hand, and your vowed offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. And there you shall eat before the eternal your God, and you shall rejoice in all which you have put your hand to do, you and your households, in which the eternal your God has blessed you." So this command to go to this place where God has chosen to put his name, it's restated several times in the scriptures. We had read Deuteronomy 16:16, and also a few other verses. Exodus 23:17 says, 3 times in the year all your males shall appear before the eternal your God. And also Exodus 34:23 says, 3 times a year all your men shall appear before the eternal God of Israel. And it's talking about the place where he put his name. It says even for where his dwelling place is. And where would that be? Where would his dwelling place be? Well, considering the question about, why we don't travel 3 times a year, we have to answer, of course, the question of, well, when the command was given, where did God choose to put his name? Well, the edict indicates that God chose to put his name where the Ark of the Covenant was located. That was his dwelling place. Figuratively speaking, even though he did come down actually to the Ark at times, that is where God said, this is where I'm going to dwell among the people of Israel, the Ark of the Covenant. And where was the Ark of the Covenant located? Well, it was located in the tabernacle in the wilderness, and that tabernacle was brought into the land of Canaan, and later we see that the temple was built, and all of the furniture, including the Ark of the Covenant, was put in this temple in Jerusalem. So the first location, the tabernacle, was in the midst of the camps of Israel. Think about that for a moment. The tabernacle in the midst of all of the camps of Israel. And the camps of Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, where people, they didn't need to travel to make a pilgrimage, if you will, to go where God chose to put his name. It was right there with them. And even though they didn't need to leave their camps, they did not violate the scriptures, even though the 3 feasts were called a chag. Now later, the location of the tabernacle was moved to Shiloh, stayed for a number of years there. It was then placed in Nob, and ultimately the furniture and the other items of the tabernacle were relocated to the temple that was built by King Solomon, and we are well aware that temple was in Jerusalem. So what may be a surprise to many people is that there is no scripture indicating that God commanded for the tabernacle to be set up in Shiloh. There is no scripture indicating that God said take the tabernacle and put it in Nob. In fact, there is no scripture indicating that God commanded for the temple to be built in Jerusalem. And so it appears anyway, I'm not saying he had nothing to do with it, but it appears that there were administrative decisions that were made by people that God was working with, people that God inspired, leaders of Jerusalem, of Israel, whether it be, where the king lived there in Jerusalem, or it was the high priest that was working with and in the tabernacle of meeting. And so, even though there is no scripture indicating that God said, erect the tabernacle here, move it over there, build a temple over here, it's clear God was working with people. God was leading people who were ordained for certain positions within the nation of Israel. And so I believe that God inspired people, moved them to put the tabernacle and the temple in certain areas. And these are the areas where God chose to put his name. It was in the midst of the camps of Israel, it was in Shiloh, it was in Nob, and then eventually it was in Jerusalem where the temple stood. And so the command given in Exodus that we had read, the command given in Deuteronomy 16, this refers to the place where the tabernacle was, where the Ark of the Covenant was, and of course where the temple stood. So selected individuals were required to travel 3 times a year, travel throughout the territory to make a pilgrimage to this location where the Ark of the Covenant was. And though the command states that all your males are to go up, it's clear that other family members were certainly welcome, but not all were required to go. Some, of course, if you think about it, the practicality of it, some would actually be unable to travel such a long distance on foot or by donkey, some kind of pack animal, because maybe they were elderly, maybe they were pregnant, maybe there was some form of illness, or perhaps there was even a need to attend to the property, the farmland, or the ranch that some people might own. And so those people who did not travel for various reasons, they still would have honored God's holy days locally, in their area, in their location. Of course, this is part of the reason why God commanded that the tribes of Israel, that common land around each city, around each area, would be given to Levites, so that there would be local priests in the area, priests that would be, administer tithes, or they would help people in various ways. And that's actually the command for that property to be given to Levites is in Numbers 35, verses 2 through 5. So everyone who was able to attend were definitely welcome to come to keep the feast where God chose to put his name during these pilgrimages. And like today, of course, those were family-friendly events. There are family-friendly events that we attend today, right? Family activities going on. Everybody can learn from what's discussed, for whether it be in services or in the conversations that are held by people afterward. All of the activities are definitely things that the entire family can enjoy. And one scripture indicating the atmosphere of the location where God put his name is in the same chapter, chapter 12 and verse 18. And this is speaking of free will offerings, where it says, "But you must eat them before the eternal your God, in the place which the eternal your God chooses, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant and your female servant, and the Levite who is within your gates. And you shall rejoice before the eternal your God in all which you put your hands to do." So obviously this is, hey, the whole family is welcome. Everybody is welcome. I want you all to come, I do. But for various reasons, not everybody would be able to come. God understood this, and he makes this provision. I think it's out of kindness to saying, all your males. It's a reference to the people that are heads of households, people maybe not people that may not even have a family, but they are still on their own, and so they're considered a head of household, and they come up to keep the feast 3 times in a year. And so let's go over a few chapters to Deuteronomy 27. The 12 tribes, the children of Israel, they were called to be an entire nation of tribes and a mixed multitude that went out with them out of Egypt. They were required to be an entire nation living under the law of God. The law of God was to be observed and honored in every city, town, village, or rural community of the land of Canaan that God gave to them. And so God's law, obviously, was to be kept by all people of the land, and God gave instructions for this early on to teach it to your children. Teach it when you come, teach it when you go, write it on the doorposts, write it on the gates of your home. Everybody needs to know the law of God. And of course, this was known from the day of Pentecost, which I believe the 10 Commandments were likely given to Israel on the day of Pentecost at Mount Sinai there. And God made a covenant with the people. He gave them his commandments. And God's law was further explained to the people by Moses and also through the 70 elders, a group of individuals ordained for such positions. It later became known as the Sanhedrin. But God explained his law in great detail to the people. And some 40 years later, God expounded on the rule of the entire nation living under the law of God, something that was required of everyone in the land. And this was after they had crossed over the Jordan. And God told the people this in Deuteronomy 27 and verse 2. He said, "It shall be on the day when you cross over the Jordan to the land which the Eternal your God is giving you, that you shall set up for yourselves large stones and whitewash them with lime." In other words, he's saying, prepare these large stones to be written on, and there's going to be a lot of writing, a lot to be recorded here. It goes on to say in verse 3, "You shall write on them all the words of this law when you have crossed over, that you may enter the land which the Eternal your God is giving you, a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Eternal your God of your fathers promised you. Therefore it shall be when you have crossed over the Jordan, that on Mount Ebal you shall set up these stones, which I command you today, and you shall whitewash them with lime, and there you shall build an altar to the Eternal your God, an altar of stones, and you shall not use an iron tool on them. And you shall build with the whole stones the altar of Eternal your God, and offer your burnt offerings on it to the Eternal your God. And you shall offer peace offerings, and you shall eat there and rejoice before the Eternal your God." And again, he reiterates, "And you shall write very plainly on the stones all the words of this law." And so these stones were set up as a monument, if you will. They were set up as a witness to the people for everyone to see, that, and they contained all the words of the law. And the reason is so that nobody in the land would say, "I don't know, I have no idea." Nobody would have an excuse. There it is, right there on the hill. You don't know, go up and read it. You know, people entering the land. Hey, these are the rules of the land here. Read it, know it, live it. So contrary to what God desired of Israel, today, in our country and around the world, nobody lives in a nation that lives entirely by the law of God. Do we? No. We don't have a Levitical priesthood. And we do not have a temple. We do not have a physical, literal place where God has chosen to put his name. However, what we do have is we have types. We have types. And so elders of the Church of God, they serve in similar roles today, as did the Levite priests. And these men in the Church of God have been ordained for such positions of authority, to teach the law of God, but uphold the law of God, to keep the law of God. And there are certain administrative decisions that need to be made, that all, of course, need to be made within the boundaries of God's law. And so it's a responsibility that elders have in the Church of God to serve what's in the best interest of the brethren, and it all must be done according to the law. And of course, this includes the observance of God's feasts. And therefore, when ministers in the Church of God, when they choose locations to observe the holy days, including the chags, or the pilgrimage feasts, it's considered to be a place where God has chosen to put his name. Because the Church of God calls itself by the name of God. Each one of us consider ourselves to be a Christian, which is the name of God. And so God hopefully has chosen to put his name on you and you and you and you and me. And so when the ministry chooses to observe the holy days and in certain locations, it is a type of what God had done in ancient times. Now, obviously, like I said, I can't say it enough, I think, that all of the decisions need to be made within the boundaries of God's law. With this in mind, understanding that we do not have a Levitical priesthood, we do not have a temple where God has chosen to put his name, it's not required for people to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Why would we go there? There's no temple there. There's no priesthood there. I'm not saying there are not Church of God people there, and some people do have feast sites in Jerusalem. But it's not required of us to go there, to the place where God said that is where he put his name at that time. So what the church has done is made an administrative decision to travel to locations other than Jerusalem to observe the Feast of Tabernacles. And this decision does not violate the Scriptures. To say we're not going to go to Jerusalem, we're going to go to Rapid City or to some other place, Branson, Missouri, or different parts of the country or the world, that is in agreement with the Scriptures. And so the decision to only keep the Feast of Tabernacles as a place where we go somewhere else, where it's, some people, even though we like to not try to treat it like a vacation, but for many people it is like a vacation because it's the only one they get every year. And so it's very enjoyable, much like a vacation is. And it's not a violation of the Scriptures for the church to say, okay, we're going to travel for this one and not the other ones because we don't have a temple. We don't have a Levitical priesthood. This was a practical decision that was made by the ministry, and they did it for the best interest of everyone involved, the brethren particularly. It was not done, as some have claimed, because of greed. I've heard some people say, the ministry was greedy, and they just wanted the offerings 3 times a year, and they said, if we only keep one of them, we get to keep all the offerings from the other 2. That's not the reason the decision was made at all. And we're going to talk a little bit more as we go forward here. The practical decision was doing what's best for the people that are involved in celebrating these days. Because, frankly, as most of us are aware, particularly in America, in many nations that are considered the West, people are unable to take 3 vacations a year. How many of us have ever been able to take 3 vacations a year? Anybody? I've never been able to do it in all my life. It's just not possible to be able to take so many vacations. I mean, there's a lot involved. But regardless of not being able to travel, during the 3 pilgrimage feasts, there are things that can be done during these chags where we still have a place where God chooses to put his name. Now, let's give you an example here. Now, of course, those of us in the room here are well aware, And I'm mostly saying this for people that might be attending online that have not heard of this. But the Eternal Church of God, during those pilgrimage feasts, we choose to meet in a hall that is outside of our regular hall. And it's simply because we're trying to keep a spirit of it, understanding that we can't all leave our jobs and travel 3 times a year. We say, okay, well, what we can do, we can go to a different location. Even though it's in our same city here, we can go to a different location. Let's still keep the idea of these pilgrimage feasts going. And so something else that we have chosen to do in the Eternal Church of God is that we have, in between the high days, we have Bible studies. And we hold them in the evening so that people that need to go to work during, in between the high days, they might be able to attend them in the evening. That's an administrative decision. There's nothing wrong with that. It's entirely in line with the Scriptures, and it's doing something that is in the best interest of those people who want to celebrate those days with us. And so the point is we're not required to leave our city, and we're also not required actually to meet in a different hall during those times to reflect our acknowledgement of the pilgrimage feasts, but this is what we choose to do. And it's right in line with the Scriptures for the reasons I had mentioned beforehand. However, we cannot teach that people must attend those Bible studies in between the high days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That if you do not come to those services in between the high days, you're violating the Scriptures. That would be wrong, because the Scriptures don't declare it. And something similar could be said regarding the Feast of Tabernacles. It's an administrative decision, and it's one we agree with, that it's good to have a service every day in between the high days of the feasts. But it's something that the church decided to do, and I think we have God's approval in this. We see that nobody can rightly say that we must leave our home, we must leave our city, we must leave our state or travel to a different part of the country 3 times a year, and if we do not, we are disobeying God. The command to attend where God has put his name, it still applies no matter where the elders of the church choose to hold a service during those holy days. And the reason is because, anybody? We have no temple. We don't have a temple, a literal physical temple where the Ark of the Covenant is, where God, we know, has chosen to put his name in that place. Now, in recent years, some have thought, and some who are not ordained as elders in the church have tried to teach other people that if you do not travel for the pilgrimage feasts, if you don't pack up your car, if you don't leave your job and leave your home for all 3 of the pilgrimage feasts, you're disobeying God. You're violating the Scriptures. And my response to that, of course, is a little lengthy here, but a simple response to that would be, you do err, not knowing the Scriptures. You can't tell people that. You can't lay this guilt trip on people and make yourselves look like, oh, you're the special ones because you're able to do that and nobody else can, and make people feel like guilty because if they leave their home and leave their job, they're going to come 3 times a year, they're going to come back with no job, no way to pay their bills. You can't do that to people. And so, a couple of scriptures here. And go ahead, in Deuteronomy, let's go back a few chapters to chapter 12 again, Deuteronomy 12. Deuteronomy 12 and, went too far. Verse 5. We'd already read this, but just to bring it back to our mind here, to recall, in verse 5 it says, you shall seek the place where the eternal your God chooses out of all your tribes to put his name there for his dwelling place, and there you shall go. And then he says this, notice this, if you jump down a few verses, verse 8. We didn't read this one. but it's definitely worth considering. You shall not at all do as we are doing here today, every man doing whatever is right in his own eyes. Well, God chose to put his name in a certain place. And God chooses, through ordained ministers, to put his name in a certain place where they say, we're going to have services here, we're going to have services over there. We're not to do everyone doing what's right in his own eyes, according to God. And sadly, we do see that happening throughout the Church of God today in some of these groups that might meet, maybe they consider themselves independent, or maybe even in some of the established, well-known organizations. We do see people, even people who are ordained ministers, who are doing what's right in their own eyes instead of what God commands. Let's go over to 2 Chronicles and chapter 30. And so we have to open the scriptures, we have to prove these things for ourselves, and we have to understand, well, what does God require of us? Some of the people that I mentioned previously who, well, frankly, in my opinion, they behave as though they're ministers in the church, even though they are not. They say that people have to leave their homes. They say that people have to travel 3 times a year, and I've heard them compare themselves to Kings Hezekiah and Josiah, who were great kings who restored temple worship and the obedience of God in Judea. But there's a big difference between Kings Hezekiah and Josiah and those people who might try to magnify themselves or their own understanding of the Bible. And here are a few of them. You see, God is the one who sets up kings, establishes leaders according to what he desires, and that's what the prophet Daniel wrote. God sets up kings. He puts people in positions of authority. And those individuals who are claiming what I had mentioned previously, they're men assuming positions. They really haven't been ordained. They haven't went through the proper protocol. Also, these men, Kings Hezekiah and King Josiah, they had the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah advising them. Now, I'm not a prophet. I'm simply an elder, a pastor. I'm pastoring this little group here. I'm doing what I can to try to help other people understand and obey God better. But I did offer these thoughts about this subject to some of these individuals, and individuals that I think are leading people astray in that regard. And the response was not welcomed. It was instead, the people, they tried to justify their behavior, and I think one of the comments even said, I don't need any minister to tell me what to do. Okay, then. Another contrast between Hezekiah and Josiah and some of these others were that these individuals were kings of Israel, put in those positions by God, and they had a Levitical priesthood. They had a temple where God literally, physically had chosen to put his name in that area. And so these individuals, they had the authority to declare the holy days, to restore God's holy days and the worship of God in Judea, because this is a place where God did choose to put his name. Now consider what was written about these individuals here. In 2 Chronicles 30 and verse 1, where it says, Hezekiah sent to all Israel and Judah, and also wrote letters to Ephraim and Manasseh, that they should come to the house of the Eternal at Jerusalem to keep the Passover to the eternal God of Israel. And so they were not making it up, choosing their own place to go. They said, no, come here, where God had chose to put his name. In another example, 2 Chronicles 35, if you go over a few pages here, 2 Chronicles 35, and, let's read verse 1. Speaking of King Josiah, it says, now Josiah kept a Passover to the Eternal in Jerusalem. And they slaughtered the Passover lambs on the 14th day of the first month. Now, go down now here to verse 18. Speaking of this Passover, kind of summarizing this here, it says, "There had been no Passover kept in Israel like that since the days of Samuel the prophet, and none of the kings of Israel had kept such a Passover as Josiah kept, with the priests and the Levites, all Judah and Israel who were present, and the inhabitants of," drumroll, Jerusalem. This is where God chose to put his name. So you see there's a big difference here between King Josiah, between King Hezekiah, and some others who think they're restoring the true worship of God. So what some have tried to do today doesn't compare to others restoring temple worship. These great kings, these individuals, they did not choose their own holy day sites. They didn't declare that God has put his name in Hebron, or God has put his name in Succoth, or God has put his name in Samaria. These men didn't take up offerings and do whatever they wanted with them. No, they did what was done according to the law, and they had a Levitical priesthood carrying this out. They had actually gathered men of Levi, sons of Aaron, and reestablished temple worship. And so enjoyable, I mean, all of us would love to be able to travel. I'm not saying, nobody should travel for the pilgrimage feast 3 times a year. We would all love to be able to do such a thing. It would be very enjoyable. And for those people who are able to do it, I'm sure it's enjoyable for you to be able to leave your job and to go and take a vacation 3 times a year. But frankly, most people, 99% of the people in the Church of God, cannot afford to travel 3 times a year. And it's wrong to tell people that unless you travel, you leave your home for Feast of Unleavened Bread and for the Feast of Weeks and for Tabernacles, you're violating the Scriptures. Because even during ancient times, as we had mentioned earlier, even during ancient times, not everyone was required to leave their home. No, not everyone was required to refrain from work in between the high days. I'm not talking about the high days themselves. Obviously, they're treated like Sabbaths. But not everybody was required. You can't work during the days in between the 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's not commanded. So you can't tell people that. As we had already covered, a male representative of each family was required to make the trek to the temple. And anybody else that would be able to become, that's a bonus. That's great. But it's not required that every family member would come. The Scriptures indicate, as we had read, that everyone was welcome, and making this a family outing, in those times it would be more like a family adventure, making such traveling such a distance. That's ideal. I think it is ideal. But the fact is, other family members were not required to make the pilgrimage. And yet they would still honor the holy days, still keep the holy days locally with brethren and with Levites. Scriptures, they say, do not forsake the Levite. Let's go back to Exodus 34. Exodus 34. So the reason for God's allowance for certain people to keep the feast locally, it really, when you think about it, it's a practical one. For most people, this would have been a very long distance to travel to Jerusalem, whether by foot or by donkey or some kind of a pack animal to travel to the temple. It would take days of travel time for many people, and of course you would need provisions, you would need funds. Most people, I think, probably would not be able to afford to take the entire family on such a long adventure when using only a festival tithe. Some women might be pregnant or perhaps nursing an infant at that time. And of course, that would make traveling on a pack animal or by foot not only difficult, it could be very dangerous. There were, of course, elderly involved. There might be people who were infirmed, people that were not unable to make the journey. And so I think God made the allowance out of kindness, out of mercy. And also, there's something else to consider, and I bring this up because of an argument that was presented by a certain individual. There would have been people, many people with farms or ranches, and they would need to ensure that their flocks, their herds, or their crops were maintained while they were away for weeks at a time. Now, if the whole family left the ranch or they left the farm unattended for weeks, 3 times a year, they could lose everything. But the opposing argument to this fact says, well, God would miraculously sustain all flocks, all herds, all crops, all farmland when everyone chose to obey him and travel. Well, of course, God is very capable of this. Would be very easy for God to do. But the problem with that is the scriptures don't say that. They don't actually say that God would do that if everybody came down or went up to keep the feast in Jerusalem. But what did God say in this regard? In regard to the pilgrimage feast and people going up to keep it? Well, he said this in Exodus 34, and I'm going to read verses 23 and 24, where he said, 3 times in the year all your men shall appear before the Lord, the eternal your God of Israel. For I will cast out the nations before you, and enlarge your borders. Neither will any man covet your land when you go up to appear before the eternal your God 3 times in the year. And so we see God's promises here. He gives them a guarantee that he will protect the borders when your men go up to keep the feast 3 times in a year. Now this guarantee here, it doesn't say anything about God saying, I'll maintain your flocks, I'll take care of your herds, I'll make sure the crops, everything's going well. And of course, even though it's possible for him to do that, it doesn't say it. It doesn't say that God says, I will heal the infirmed, I will strengthen the elderly, I will take care of the nursing mothers for the journey. It doesn't say that. It's very possible that he could do that, obviously. No problem for God, but it doesn't say that. What it says is that God would protect the borders of Israel from invading nations when the men traveled 3 times a year. Now, why would God say that and not say the other things that I had mentioned that, where I'm saying it doesn't say those things, but it says this? Why would God say what he does? Well, the reason is because God already told them. He told them that a male representative, your heads of household, the males, they were to go up to keep the feast 3 times a year in the place where God chose to put his name. Others could stay behind. Now, since the heads of household would be out of town, away from the property for weeks at a time, an extended period of time, the borders of Israel would be compromised. That's a very large, not just a workforce, but a very large military force would leave the borders of Israel and go up to Jerusalem. And so because of this, people might be a little concerned. Well, wait a minute. I'm leaving my family and my property behind unprotected. What's going to happen? And God said, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I will protect your borders. I will take care of the safety of the people that stay behind in these areas. Now, a principle for this, of course, could be entertained. You could say, this means that God would take care of the flocks and herds and the crops and everything as well, but it doesn't say that, so we can't read into it and say, well, this definitely applies. And frankly, if you think about it, even though this verse is not entirely applicable to our current situation, living in a society that is not committed to God's authority in their lives, if you and I, if we were to tell our employers, you know, I'm leaving town 3 times a year, and I'm going to be gone for an extended period of time, and it doesn't matter what you say, I'm going. Now, if that was required by God, we would all do it. But it's not something that's required at this time, and if we did do we would come home likely unemployed. We would lose our jobs, we'd have to start all over again. Consider this as well, even during the age of the 12 apostles, during their age, a temple still existed. There were Levites that carried out the services of the temple during the time of the apostles after Christ was crucified. And even so, we see, and the scriptures can be found in Acts 20 and verse 6, also 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 8, we see that the Apostle Paul kept some of these holy days, these chags, these pilgrimage feasts, with brethren locally. He did so in Philippi, he did so in Ephesus. And also Paul told the church in Corinth, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 34, he told them to eat a meal at home before gathering for the Passover ceremony. Now, obviously, these brethren that he told to eat a meal at home and then come keep the Passover, they were not traveling to Jerusalem. They would not have enough time to keep the Passover ceremony and then, okay, get on your horse and start trekking off to Jerusalem. They wouldn't have made it in time for the beginning of the feast. And yet, they did not violate the scriptures because they didn't make the pilgrimage. Today, ordained men in the Church of God, we pray about it. We hope that most people throughout the wider Church of God that are ordained, we hope that they're led by God in making decisions that are, of course, within the boundaries of God's law. And God's name is spiritually placed where God's people meet. Wherever God's people meet and worship Him in spirit and truth, God's name is in that location. And though some ministers have made mistakes over the years, and I think some maybe intentionally made those mistakes, so which would not make them mistakes, but this has really left a bad taste in the mouth of many people, and I'm sorry about that. I really am, and I feel very badly for everyone involved. But it doesn't mean that we can just disregard everything that any minister teaches and we can just do our own thing, every man doing what's right in his own eyes. In my mind, to do such a thing would be a sin of presumptuousness. And God sets up kings. He ordains men to have certain positions of authority, whether it be in the church or even in the governments of men. And so the point is, it's not required to travel during all of these events, the 3 times a year. But we should when we can. And the reason I say that is because I don't want anybody to hear this message and to start thinking, oh, well, you know, it's kind of a burden to keep that festival tithe. I could use that money for something else. And, I'd rather go to the Bahamas instead of going to a place where the Feast of Tabernacles is being celebrated. We can't do that. We need to do what we can. We need to tithe. We need to keep a festival tithe. We need to go to those places where God has chosen to put His name through an ordained ministry. Frankly, I feel that it's an act of kindness that God has allowed us at this time, not needing to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year, which would be very, very hard, very difficult, if not impossible for many people. It's an act of kindness. God understanding what the world would become like over the last 2,000 years. And you see, our society is not structured in such a way as where we can go out in our backyard and we can slaughter a Passover lamb or a goat, and we can dress it and we can roast the entire thing at twilight. We're not able to do such a thing. Most people are unable to do something like that. And so Christ gave us a way to still keep the Passover in a way that is just as meaningful, and it's also, in our age, practical. isn't it? You see, most people are only able to take a week or two off of work or out of school a year in order to go to a place where we can celebrate the feast and rejoice with like-minded brethren. Others may be unable to travel at all during any of these feasts for various reasons, but you're not violating the scriptures if you don't, if you can't. But don't use it as an excuse to not try. You know, God did designate feast sites through ministers today, and there are things that we should attempt to do as long as we are able. We have to do all that we can, all that we are able, according to God's instruction first, and of course, direction sometimes given by elders in the church, as long as it's in line with God's instruction, right? Yes. So observing the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, in the locations that are designated by ministers in the church, and as we are able, this actually fulfills the command of the chags, the pilgrimage feasts in our age. And these are places where we continue to worship and to honor the God of mercy, the God of love, the God of hope, and we do so in spirit and in truth.